I'm John Batchelor, sitting next to Mary Kissel, the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, and the host of Opinion Journal each day at 1:30 p.m. at WSJ Live. And we're joined by Washington Examiner investigative reporter Sarah Westwood, who's here in New York with us and has joined us in the studio. It's the first time I've had an occasion to greet Sarah in person. We've spoken over these last weeks because Sarah is the lucky beneficiary of the gift that will give forever. This, of course, is the Clinton Foundation. Sarah, a very good evening to you. We've had some fun conversations because there every day you could do 2 stories on the Clinton Foundation. The drip, drip, drip is fascinating. I want to establish, however, that the information we have now is early days. In our conversations, there has always been something else that you say, well, we'll have more of that in future. We'll get to that. Is that where we still are, early days of the Clinton Foundation revelations?
Absolutely, because every week it seems we find out that there's another layer financially or with these quid pro quo actions that haven't been disclosed. And the only way that the Clinton Foundation has been willing to disclose this information is if they've been caught red-handed. You saw that on their tax forms when it became known that there were mistakes made on their 990s that they submitted to the IRS. Then they admit that they made mistakes filing taxes, but certainly not before. There's been no proactive disclosures.
Now, when we say the Clinton Foundation, that sounds like a singular entity, but you just said layers. What do you mean by that?
Right, and that's sort of a confusing term because the Clinton Foundation, as we know it, is actually comprised of about a dozen different enterprises from, a climate initiative, the Clinton Health Access Initiative, the Clinton Global Initiative, which is one of the most controversial aspects of the Clinton Foundation. But each one has a different set of rules that it plays by. With this memorandum of understanding that the State Department worked out with the White House, we've seen that it hasn't been applied consistently to all of the different arms of the Clinton Foundation, and that's where they run into trouble.
Because the White House did have concerns from the very beginning. Otherwise, why would you need an MOU?
Absolutely. It was a major stumbling block to her confirmation in the Senate because they were worried that foreign entities would do exactly what they did, which is donate to the Clinton Foundation, and perhaps there would be this appearance of impropriety. And so they wanted to make sure that conflicts of interest wouldn't occur. This was negotiated between people that you still see involved with the Clintons. John Podesta was involved. Cheryl Mills was involved with hammering out this memorandum of understanding.
Cheryl Mills, you mean the lady who double dipped and had a private sector salary while she was also drawing a salary from us, the American taxpayer?
Yes, that same Cheryl Mills.
I see John smiling.
Well, it's just because I try to keep up with this, but I need more data. And Sarah's here, so I'm going to complain to her. You go back and you tell your bosses at the Washington Examiner that we're desperate for endless amounts of data. That this is the original story that has no end. The trail leads into, this number. The Washington Post ran a story within these last days explaining that the Clinton Foundation was well-meaning and it was a little chaotic and it resembled Mr. Clinton's personality. I'm not sure that was flattering, but it was meant to be exculpatory. However, there was a number used in there, 200,000 donors. Have you ever seen that number before? Do you have any reason to doubt it? Do you think that's how many people could be involved when we get all the story?
It doesn't surprise me because there's a lot of different ways that you can donate to the Clinton Foundation, right? You can write them a check. There's a donation. You can attend the Clinton Global Initiative annual fundraiser, and you have to pay $20,000 to attend. That's been a major way that they've amassed millions of dollars over the years. Or you can invite Bill Clinton to speak somewhere and pay your speaking fees directly to the Clinton Foundation, and all of those things occurred many times.
Yeah, that was a story the New York Times ran. I was surprised that it didn't get more coverage. It seemed like they were shaking down charities for $500,000 speaking fees. How was that kosher?
I remember the story you're talking about was with Padma Lakshmi.
Exactly,
right.
Exactly.
And that's what people wonder when you see these massive speaking fees were taken from organizations, and it didn't necessarily seem that they had philanthropic intentions. That's when these questions are raised about what was the Clinton Foundation really about at the end of the day.
Right, because the charity was building homes for children in Aceh, Indonesia that got wiped out by the tsunami?
Exactly, and their biggest expense from that fundraiser was Bill Clinton appearing. Right.
Bill Clinton.
I want to put the Clinton Foundation story together with the ongoing revelations of Mrs. Clinton's email. The word revelation is merely for camouflage, because there are very few revelations right now, except for those picked up by FOIA, which is the Freedom of Information Act, and what you'd have to say is the tardy recovery of some of the data trail by the Inspector General at the State Department and also at the National Archives. This is also part of the story. Do we have reason to believe there's Clinton Foundation information in the emails they're trying to recover from the State Department years? Did Mrs. Clinton keep it very careful, this silo, this silo, this silo? Is everything mixed up? Do we know?
The problem is we have absolutely no idea, because she maintained all of these emails on a private server. So how could we know, how she organized her communications? But the problem is, if the proper protocols were taken ethically, if she recused herself from deciding on any policy that might have posed a conflict of interest with a foundation donor, those are emails that she could easily produce and exonerate herself, but you haven't seen her come out and do that. In fact, you've seen her erase just as many emails as she disclosed.
Now, the Inspector Generals, this is a fascinating part of the story that you've broken. What was the oversight exactly of Hillary Clinton and her emails, the ones that actually were on government servers, not on her private server?
Right. Well, what we saw, which has raised many red flags, in the intervening days, is that she had a temporary inspector general running the State Department for her entire tenure while she was there. And temporary inspectors generals, they do not have the same type of oversight as permanent ones, because they're hoping to get that nomination to the permanent job. They don't want to rock the boat. And it's a political nomination at the end of the day. And what we saw through Harold Geisel, the temporary inspector general, was that he was manipulated by top State Department officials. And we know that because it was put out in reports, subsequent reports after the permanent IG came in.
Do I remember in your reporting, Sarah, these things run together. I beg your pardon if I've confused this, that at the State Department, they were concerned about the lack of care or caution taken with Mrs. Clinton as she was leaving the State Department about the fate of her emails. My memory is that there's a trail of people saying, what are you going to do? Is this the right thing? Did I read that in your story?
You did. That was raised on the side of the National Archives and Records Administration. They're responsible for making sure that these records are preserved properly. And when Mrs. Clinton was leaving the State Department, some of the top records officials were banting back and forth about concerns that they had that Mrs. Clinton was going to take her records with her to the Clinton Presidential Library in Little Rock, Arkansas. That was happening in December of 2012. We know now that the National Archives knew about this problem as far back as 2012, and that State Department officials were consulting with the National Archives to find some sort of legal justification to, back up why these emails weren't preserved properly 2 years earlier. And so now we see through these emails that are getting released through the Freedom of Information Act, like you said, from other organizations, that's the only way we're getting insight into what was going on in Clinton world, because she kept such a tight grip on her own records.
And we also know, I know my colleagues on the news side of the Wall Street Journal have also reported that Cheryl Mills, the confidant, the number 2 to Hillary Clinton, was vetting Freedom of Information Act requests in a way that, shall we say, is not consistent with how the law is supposed to operate. Am I exaggerating there, Sarah?
Oh, no, I'm so glad you brought that up. That is a huge violation of the Freedom of Information Act. To have a political appointee manipulating what does and doesn't get released under the Freedom of Information Act is a huge breach of trust. It should always be separated with the career people. The career federal officials should be making those decisions. FOIA is already abused across the federal government so much. People use these exemptions, particularly one that's called B5. It's referred to in the FOIA community as the withhold it if you can exemption, because you can apply them pretty liberally under the law. It's written broadly, and that's what Cheryl Mills was manipulating and exploiting at the State Department, and that kept a lot of the records that the State Department did have from getting released at the time.
Well, is this the next big story? I mean, Cheryl Mills, she's coming up a lot, drawing 2 salaries, manipulating Freedom of Information Act requests. Shouldn't we Freedom of Information Act request all of her emails? Forget Hillary Clinton. Maybe she's the one that we should be looking at.
And there are some groups that are doing that. You see lawsuits in federal court right now with some of these watchdog groups suing to get Cheryl Mills's records. It's something we don't know how many of those were contained on the private server as well. We know Huma Abedin had a private address on that server. It's presumably, Cheryl Mills had one as well.
The gift that keeps on giving. Yes. We thank Sarah Westwood. It's a pleasure to meet you, Sarah. Thanks for coming to New York. Of the Washington Examiner investigative reporter on both the Clinton Foundation and the emails. Mary Kissel, the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal. I'm John Batchelor.